So I got a question about the future of First Nations in Canada, which is partly a purely political issue and is partly an educational issue. Do I want to say issue? Do I want to say question? It's a question that's going to be answered partly in the purest political sense. It's going to be decided in Parliament. It's going to be decided on the streets. It could be decided through armed revolution, but that seems unlikely. Seems like armed uprisings are not going to be that important in the 21st century in determining this issue. Could be. And there are some really extreme circumstances that any outside observer would say would justify armed uprisings, so that may be in the cards. Nevertheless, the 21st century, as pathetic and self-destructive as those violent uprisings may be, nevertheless, that is definitely possible in terms of what happens in the next few decades of these negotiations for the future. But yeah, on the one hand, there are purely political decisions to be made about the future of First Nations, and then there are educational decisions. There's a question of whether or not the Cree language is going to go extinct. So in setting up what I have to say on this, one, I remember I once had a conversation with a guy. He was a full-time teacher of the Cree language. I was at that time a full-time student of the Cree language. And he was very particular in clarifying to me, in terms of the use of verbs in English, he didn't see his job description as preserving the Cree language. He saw his job as promulgating the Cree language. We don't use the word promulgate that often in English, and that really made me stop and think about how he sees himself, how he sees his job, how he sees the struggle for these languages and these people in the future. And it's an interesting point because for me also, my involvement with First Nations was very forward-looking. I wasn't interested in studying or preserving their traditional culture. I'm interested in the future of these languages and the future of these people. Of course, I'm interested in their history to some extent, but I basically have a forward-looking engagement with these issues. Now, by contrast, I once saw a TV interview with a First Nations language advocate from the West Coast. And on the west coast of Canada, the situation is really different because you have really small pockets of languages, and they're all close to extinction. And there's no easy way forward in terms of merging them into larger units. The threat of language extinction is very real, and it's very different. But so this particular guy being interviewed, he was working to revive a language that I think got down to only 5 living speakers, something like that. The last 5 or 10 people who could speak this language. And then he revived it partly just through the glory of the internet. He called for volunteers. He asked people to just volunteer and learn this language, regardless of their ethnic heritage. He said, hey, look, this language is close to extinction. I want to get some people together. And so, that was why this was a TV news item. It was a relatively fun and upbeat attitude towards a very serious issue. And he had some success. So I forget, he got it up to 50 people or something who could speak this language and had some fun with it. And obviously, because the language was so close to extinction, I think he did make some simplifications to the language. He made it easier to learn, and put together an easy-to-use dictionary and this kind of thing, easy-to-use educational materials. But, of course, there's a question there, too, if you're doing that. To what extent is this becoming a fictional language? A constructed language, people like to say. Is it becoming something like Elvish from Lord of the Rings? Or are you really accurately, preserving and promulgating an indigenous language? So those are questions. But in the interview with this guy, I remember he said, and this was his official position, he said he recognizes that the language he's supporting will never be a language used to buy a hot dog at a hot dog stand in downtown Vancouver or in any big city, but that he sees the role of the language as being something that's just special within that community, within people who have that ancestry or that heritage, or people who want to join, people who become part of the community, people who join the community. And I remember sitting and listening to that, and before I heard him say that, I really thought, that is the opposite of what I believe. To me, it really matters that at First Nations University of Canada, the no smoking signs are in English. I don't want that. I want them to say no smoking in Cree. To me, it really matters that when you go up to a bank machine in that part of Canada at that time, the bank machine has about 8 buttons for languages. It is mentioned there were 8 buttons on the screen. You could also use the number of buttons. And the language choices are English, French, or Chinese. To me, it really matters that we have Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk. We have some other buttons there for some other languages. Why? Because this is Canada. Theoretically, I really do want there to be hot dog vendors. I'm vegan, so it's not the best example for me. To me, it really matters whether or not in downtown Vancouver there's a role for indigenous languages in that culture and that society. I am actually not comfortable at all with these languages and cultures being remaindered to reservations. I mean, remaindered is maybe not the word, but I guess it is what I mean. The actual process of creating reservations, of putting up fences and walls and saying those people exist over there, that culture exists over there, that is something very fundamentally I oppose. Of course, I think it was bad historically looking back, but the point is we're now looking forward. We're now looking at the change we can make in the future. And I feel like saying, no, God damn it, either this language exists at the bank, at the bank machine, at the hot dog stand, or it doesn't exist at all. And this is a really false attitude to think you can preserve a language within those dotted lines. And, no. Back when I was at First Nations University of Canada, I talked to the professors about getting the first physics textbook in the Cree language, the first chemistry textbook. And I said, if we don't do this, the language dies. Another specific example, what about the Constitution of Canada? What about the Constitution of the United States? Have you ever seen the Constitution of the United States written in a native language? It's written in English, of course. Constitution of Canada is written in English and French. Why? Why? Either this matters enough to be in these languages also. Of course, there are more difficult questions. Probably the hardest thing is policing. Or, can you plead your own case in court? Can you plead your own case in court? Can you appear in Parliament and talk politics in these languages or not? On and on and on it goes. Mm-hmm. So this is an answer to a question. The actual wording of the question I was given is, what do I think about the reconciliation process? And my response to that is kind of parallel to that anecdote I told about the teacher who didn't want to talk about extinction and preservation. He wanted to use the word promulgate. I do not see this in terms of reconciliation at all. Like, to me, that's irrelevant. I don't care if you're reconciled or not. I care about when you go to the bank machine, what language is there at the bank machine. I care about, even in theory, can you go into the bank? Can you go into the bank and get a loan? As a native person, it's a huge barrier. I mean, that always is with racism. That's one of the most telling signs of racism. Do black people really have equal access to a mortgage or a home loan, a loan to build a new home or something, to white people? Of course, for most American history, the answer was no. The racism was most obvious in getting a loan at a bank. But do native people really have the ability to do that as native people, just because of racism, but then do they have the ability to do that in their own language? It's a huge, huge step to fill out a loan application in Cree or Ojibwe. To me, that has nothing to do with reconciliation. And if you just think about it implicitly, what I'm talking about is a very different vision of the future, very different kind of society. And there are precedents. One of the most extreme is Switzerland. Nobody thinks of Switzerland. Switzerland is a modern Western democracy. They have all the good things of a democratic society, but they take really seriously the rights of indigenous languages, including some very small languages like Romansh. Romansh. I've met a member of that group, which is a Latin-derived language native there, including, of course, their Italians, the Swiss Italians, and so on and so forth, and even Swiss German itself, where they take really seriously the obligation to provide education in these languages, to access government services in these languages. Switzerland has done it. In some ways, an example like Switzerland, I think, is a positive example for the way forward. And, China gets a lot of bad press. For different ethnic groups in China, it's a different story. But I got to tell you, where we are right now in Dahong, China, when I walk down the street, every road sign is in 3 languages. Every single road sign, all of the government services signs, they're in Chinese, Dahong Dai, and Jingpo. Jingpo is also known as Kachin. It's the same language. And they take very seriously. There are very serious foundations for each of those groups. The best high school here, is the ethnic minority high school, which is devoted to serving those people. Not the worst. You'll never see that in Canada. Never once do you see white people saying they're competing to get their kids into a Cree high school, competing to get their kids into an Ojibwe high school. The Chinese people compete to try to get their kids into the ethnic minority high school and primary school and middle school, by the way, because it's the best school. The best, the most elite education here is the special education for Native people. It's excellent. The pursuit of excellence in education for Native people. And yes, I mean, at my own university campus last night when I was taking the bus home, they were practicing tribal dances on campus. I just mentioned as the bus went out last night as I was on my way home from work. Now, obviously some of that stuff is a little bit Disneyland, but hey, that's okay. I'm not so opposed to Disneyland. But literally we have people in tribal garb dancing with swords and bows and arrows. That's part of the preservation of culture here too. You guys probably get that's not really the side of the game I relate to positively. It's not really what I'm into, but some people are, and that's going to be a piece in the puzzle too. Is that kind of surface level cultural preservation. So yeah, that's really my response is, to me, the word reconciliation is irrelevant. I don't want reconciliation. I want to win. Like I really see that as a struggle where the question is, will Native people win a place for themselves in Parliament? Right now there is zero representation of Native people in Parliament. There is zero representation of Native people in the the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's ridiculous. It's just a white man assigned as a portfolio out of Parliament to be the dictator over First Nations. We have a ridiculous colonial system of government, legacy of British parliamentary system, and so on. It makes absolutely no sense for how First Nations people are governed and so on. There are very obvious political changes that need to happen, but none of them can be explained in terms of reconciliation. There are very obvious changes that need to happen in terms of just land ownership. Who owns Toronto Island? I could give a million examples of this in terms of settlement land ownership. Who's going to do something really positive and visionary for the future in terms of, giving First Nations the foothold in this country that Ukrainians got and took for granted? Look up the history of preemption in British Columbia. They were handing out valuable farmland that's now worth millions of dollars. They're handing out parcel of land for free to anyone who was white at exactly the same time they were taking it away from Native people. And this is not ancient history. And those people, the people who got preemption in British Columbia, the people who got that land for free, they're today the millionaire class of BC. They're now the wealthy in that province. But in order, so we did that to help Ukrainian immigrants. We handed out free land to Ukrainians and Germans and Poles. And those are the people who settled Western Canada. But, they didn't even speak English. Just saying it wasn't like the British Empire only benefited white British people, but it only benefited white people. It was a very, very clear racist and racialist mandate. So in terms of really transferring a lot of land and valuable land, not remote land nobody wants, and that we kick them off. Then when we discover diamonds or gold under that remote land, then they get kicked off again. This is a huge pattern in Canada because we give them what we think is worthless land. It turns out, but no, I can't see that in terms of reconciliation. It's not a question of two sides that need to be reconciled. It's a disaster that we need to dig our way out of, and either we're going to dig our way out of it before the languages go extinct, or after.